Hi, everybody. This is Trey Everett. I'm with the Northwest Minnesota Arts Council, and I'm here on StreamYard. I'm with Kristen Eggerling, who also worked with the Arts Council. And this is our ongoing StreamYard series to introduce artists in our region and to just help people become more aware of the arts and to be an encouragement to people in our region like yourself to participate in the arts. And so this StreamYard right now, this is a series of three different sections. And this is in relation to our upcoming exhibit, which is in Thief River Falls at Northland Community and Technical College. And this exhibit coming up, which will start July 30th and run through the end of September. The theme is Elemental, which is Earth, Air, Fire, Water, and Space. And so for this exhibit, we're reaching out to writers and illustrators. And so if you're a writer, or if you're a poet, or if you do some illustration work, we're encouraging you to consider submitting some work in relation to our theme, Elemental. And we're asking that the submissions are received by myself by July 12th. And then I'll need to receive them physically, either in the mail, or you can send them via email by the next week, July 17th. And our plan is that we will take your pieces of poetry or written works or illustrations, and we'll display them ourselves, frame them ourselves in an 8.5 by 11 frame. And so they'll all be uniform and have a distinct look and feel in the gallery. So you don't have to worry about framing your artwork. You can just either send it in or by mail, or you can just email it to me. And there's more about all of this on our website. So if you have any questions, you can check that out, or you can contact me, and Kristen will have my information and hers with this StreamYard later. So right now, I just want to introduce Dale Jacobson. And Dale is going to be leading just a series of three short kind of inspirational talks about how to get started in thinking about writing about this theme, Elemental. And just a little bit about Dale. Dale was an adjunct university professor at University of North Dakota. He was an honorary poet laureate of North Dakota. And he's published about 10 books, and he's been writing his whole life. So we're really excited for Dale to be coming on and to be leading us in this series. And so right now, I'm just going to turn it over to Dale.
Oh, there I am. Hi, everyone. So I see this episode, these talks, is trying to open people up to the possibility of writing in terms of this motif, earth, air, fire, water, and space. It's kind of interesting that we end up with space. That's because the original alchemical terms, elements, were the four that we're familiar with. And the fifth one was life, where you put all those four elements together and you created life. And I find it interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit about certain qualities of language that might be helpful to allow people into this writing process. And it's interesting to me that, the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, were very concrete for the people who utilize them, coming directly out of observation and so on. In fact, fire and water are opposites of each other as they were thought of. And those have been replaced now, of course, through science, with strong force, nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, which I guess is now tied in with the electromagnetic force, and then the bafflement of all physics, which is gravity. So those are also very concrete, but we end up with life, which is a little more abstract. So how do we get to allow the abstract term to work in concrete ways? And that's what I would like to talk a little bit about. I sometimes have used the example of stone, rock, and so on to illustrate levels of abstraction. Stone can be the material, and it can be virtually anything. Rock can also be the material, but both of those, stone and rock, can also be very specific things. You can throw a stone, you can throw a rock, but what happens when they become concrete is the context in which they're presented determines that you're no longer talking about the material itself, you're talking about a size and shape of something you can put in your slingshot or in your hand and throw. As the language becomes more concrete, using these same examples, you're no longer taught, you can't do that and say you can't be abstract anymore. For example, if you take the word pebble, that's a pretty clear image. If you take sand, that's even a little more clear. And you can even become more specific with that and talk about different kinds of sand, sugar sand, and so on. So in some way, for poetry, abstraction is sort of the enemy of poetry, but this isn't to say it shouldn't be used. We have all sorts of religious poetry, and I'm not talking here about anything except as an example. God is perhaps one of the most abstract words we have. Freedom is another. And these words don't mean much to us, really, in poetry anyway, until we put them into a context. And when that happens, we bring them into our sensory perceptions. So I would like to point out a poem here by Carl Sandburg, which I'm not going to say it deals with abstraction, but in a very concrete way. And I don't think there's an abstract word in it, but you'll see how it moves through various levels of specificity. See sunsets, give us keepsakes. Prairie gloamings, pay us for prayers. Mountain clouds on bronze skies, give us great memories. Let us have summer roses. Let us have tawny harvest haze in pumpkin time. Let us have springtime faces to toil for and play for. Let us have the fun of booming winds on long waters. Give us dreamy blue twilights of winter evenings to wrap us in a coat of dreaminess. Moonlight, come down, shine down, moonlight. Meet every bird cry and every song calling to a hard old earth, a sweet young earth. So perhaps the most abstract word in there was dreaminess, but I think as in the context of these other examples, it takes on a certain experience for us. And what I would maybe suggest as a possibility here is to try to get into a poem in the same way Carl Sandburg did. If you want to deal with an abstract concept like freedom, for example, look at what that means for you. Here's another example I sometimes have used. Lots of times a poem will begin with an overall conclusive statement. The party was fun. But buried within that abstract statement is an internal question that is a follow-up. And we oftentimes follow it up with this question such as, well, what do you mean? The party was awful. Well, what do you mean? Why? And the answer to that is usually some form of example. So we have an example that works this way. Well, Joe is always getting drunk and throwing wine in people's faces. It makes the party awful. Or Joe is always so kind and giving that his parties are always enjoyable. So what happens is we go to something specific to make the general summary statement clear, to clarify it. If I could, I would like to use another example here. And this is from Kristen Edgerling, actually her book, Breath of Wilderness, about Sigurd Olson. And it starts out with a general statement. Sig Olson's guiding philosophy was, a man fights for the land he loves, and if he loves it enough, he will never give up. Now that sounds very good, and we can relate to it in many ways, but we don't know the cost of that until later on in this chapter, because Sig Olson wanted to restrict certain uses of the forest for commercial purposes, and this did not go well with the people in the town where he lived. And so we get this example of what that cost, fighting for the land and never giving up, actually means. Sig was well known and loved throughout the United States, but love in a small town wasn't always easy. People in northeastern Minnesota were angry that he wanted to place restrictions on the wilderness. They thought that they would lose their jobs and their way of life if they weren't allowed to use the wild places as they had in the past. The townspeople felt that Sig had betrayed his community, and Sig and Elizabeth became two of the most unpopular residents of Ely. People crossed to the other side of the street to avoid them. Fellow parishioners moved away from them in church. Clerks refused to serve them at the grocery store. The mayor referred to him as a far-fetched dreamer, and others swore at Sig and Elizabeth and called them obscene names. And it goes on a little bit, but you get the idea. And so, one way into this is to start with a general statement and then look to your own experience. Look to what you actually mean when you say something in a general way. And I would suggest paying very close attention to your experience. You might go into childhood, for example, because childhood experience is always genuine, it seems to me anyway. Use what you know. Go into childhood where discovery loves awe or terror. And you can make that real living by doing exactly what Kristen did here, giving examples, showing what the cost of commitment to the wilderness was, or to some belief that you have. Expand on an example, what you know, and be faithful to it. Don't let anyone else tell you what your experience means. It's entirely yours to make real for the world to communicate that way. Access your own feelings about the experience and describe it in detail. And we can all do this. This is not something that belongs only to experienced writers or famous ones or whatever. Anyone can go into their own experience, look at it in detail, because that's where the life of that experience is. I have a poem that I would like to share that does some of this in terms of making a social commentary. And as it happens, this was written about several decades ago, and it does use the four elements: water, earth, fire, and air, although it couples them with other qualities that we find in ourselves: dream, labor, voice, and spirit. Spirit being, for me, air, fire connected to voice, earth to labor, and water to dream. So I'll just read this and we'll see how it goes. No, the punished past will not cease to suffer, and would not suffer alone, would not forget those who refuse to change it, despite the non-department of non-recognitions that recognized only the non-recognition of all suffering not ordained or divine, despite the heavenly and blissful lack of conscience or consciousness, while the nation shipped the youth of its poor off to war. And the draft board decided who was expendable and who was not. Nevertheless, the punished past continued to punish the present, obeyed its own recognitions like the winds that would not cease. And the body bags came back despite the giving death, 2,000 years old. The moon continued in its orbit, the rivers refused to flow backwards, and the fundamental particles continued their fundamental arrangements: water, earth, fire, air, and in us, dream, labor, voice, spirit. To these elements I was born, at harmony in themselves, though sundered and at war in us. And from into their powers I came, the occult analogies contemporized in the mathematical loom of the interweaving physics. From into the elements I came without memory to a strange country that could hardly talk to itself. Though I almost heard, far away, like a correspondence from the future weaving through the wind, a choir of children singing an old language, until I heard again the winds worry through the weeds with the hollow voices of the nations dead. So that's a poem that comes out of my experience with the Vietnam War and those times. And, it doesn't have to be social, it doesn't have to be political, but it's something that you strongly have experienced in your own life. Look into the details and bring that forward through those concrete. And then the abstract concept will filter through, oftentimes entirely on its own. So maybe that's enough for this session, and we can end that here for now.